que consideramos estratégico para la región en el contexto de la crisis actual: la diplomatura en litigio climático en América Latina y el Caribe. Una propuesta de formación orientada principalmente a juezas, jueces y operadores jurídicos en general de toda la región, con el aval de la Pontificia Academia de las Ciencias Sociales del Vaticano. El Instituto Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, que hoy impulsa esta propuesta, fue creado por el Papa Francisco en agosto del año 2023, como parte de un mandato explícito para contribuir desde el ámbito jurídico a la construcción de una justicia social, ambiental y cultural en América Latina. En la encíclica Laudato Si, el Santo Padre nos llama con claridad a asumir la tarea del cuidado de la casa común, subrayando la urgencia de una conversión ecológica integral que interpele también al mundo del derecho. El litigio climático no es simplemente una herramienta jurídica más. Es una respuesta creativa y necesaria frente a las públicas y los compromisos internacionales para abordar la crisis ambiental. Se trata de un campo en constante crecimiento en el cual el derecho se articula con la ciencia climática, con el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos y con el compromiso ético de proteger la biodiversidad y los territorios. A través del litigio climático consideramos que los tribunales se están convirtiendo cada vez más en escenarios donde se disputa el rumbo de nuestras sociedades. Desde el reconocimiento de los derechos de las generaciones futuras hasta la exigencia de la responsabilidad estatal y corporativa o empresarial por daños ambientales. En este contexto, el objeto central de la diplomatura que hoy inauguramos es fortalecer capacidades jurídicas y judiciales para enfrentar la emergencia climática, ofreciendo una formación rigurosa, interdisciplinaria y contextualizada. Queremos contribuir a que quienes ejercen la función judicial o se desempeñan en espacios jurídicos clave puedan incorporar herramientas legales, conocimientos científicos y marcos éticos para actuar con decisión y legitimidad. Esta conferencia se realiza además en vísperas de un acontecimiento que consideramos histórico: la opinión consultiva sobre emergencia climática y derechos humanos que emitirá la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos y que probablemente sea una de las más importantes de su historia. Por todo ello, estamos convencidos de que hoy abrimos un espacio de reflexión y acción que es urgente y transformador, y agradecemos muy especialmente a la participación de tres grandes referentes, los conferencistas que nos acompañan: al doctor Antonio Herman Benjamin, al doctor Durwood Sailki y al doctor Veerabhadram Ramanathan, y también a todos y todas ustedes que se han sumado a esta convocatoria. Entonces, en primer lugar, quiero presentar al doctor Herman Benjamin, ministro del Superior Tribunal de Justicia de Brasil y una de las máximas autoridades en derecho ambiental a nivel internacional. Forma parte de la dirección del Instituto Judicial Global sobre el Medio Ambiente, integra el Consejo Asesor del Programa de Naciones Unidas para el Medio Ambiente y ha sido miembro del Grupo de Expertos Jurídicos de Crímenes contra el Medio Ambiente de la Secretaría General de Naciones Unidas y en el Consejo Ambiental de Brasil. Su labor como juez, académico, promotor de reformas estructurales ha sido fundamental para fortalecer la justicia ambiental en América Latina, y es un verdadero honor que nos acompañe hoy. Antonio, muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación. Te escuchamos.
Muchas gracias, Lucas. Eu vou falar em português, aproveitando a oportunidade que não é comum de nós termos interpretação do português para o espanhol e para o inglês. Eu queria inicialmente agradecer ao Instituto pela organização deste curso, que me parece não apenas oportuno, mas oportuno duas vezes, porque cuida não só de mudanças climáticas, um tema hoje verdadeiramente existencial para a humanidade, mas cuida do tema na perspectiva dos direitos humanos. Não é a única perspectiva, evidentemente, mas não deixa de ser uma perspectiva fundamental. Queria saudar os dois colegas que participam desta sessão inaugural, em especial o meu colega amigo de décadas, o professor Daoud Zalk, está aqui conosco, já está conosco, e todas e todos os participantes deste curso. Nos 30 minutos que eu tenho, eu pretendo analisar esta temática sob dois enfoques. O primeiro tem a ver com uma preocupação crescente que eu tenho a respeito de como o que nós chamamos direito do clima, direito das mudanças climáticas, vem se posicionando no âmbito da ciência do direito. O segundo ponto que eu quero analisar, aí já é olhando mais para o tema propriamente dito, a conjugação, mudanças climáticas e direitos humanos, mas fazendo uma série de questionamentos, mais perguntas do que propriamente respostas, algumas dessas perguntas diretamente relacionadas com o trabalho de nós, os juízes. Comecemos, então, com o primeiro ponto. Como eu disse, uma preocupação que eu cada vez mais tenho. É que as mudanças climáticas, por mais fundamentais que sejam para a existência humana, é também fundamental para a existência ou sobrevivência daquilo que nós chamamos comunidade da vida, ou seja, da biosfera. E, evidentemente, seja por razões didáticas, seja por outras razões igualmente legítimas, nós podemos utilizar lentes estritamente humanas para analisar a temática das mudanças climáticas. Mas essas lentes estritamente humanas não nos dão a totalidade da fotografia. Ou seja, nos últimos 15 anos, nós assistimos quase que uma explosão de estudos do número de especialistas em direito das mudanças climáticas. É um processo migratório de natureza jurídica. Esses especialistas, a maior parte desses especialistas, vem daquilo que nós chamamos o direito ambiental, a nave-mãe. E o direito ambiental tem vários capítulos. E um desses capítulos sempre foi o clima. Porque mesmo as primeiras leis da nossa região a tratar da proteção do meio ambiente como guarda-chuva incluíram, ou já incluíam, o clima como um dos elementos do meio ambiente. Ao definirem os elementos do ambiente, essas leis, eu poderia citar várias, nacionais, incluíam, se não o clima com nome e sobrenome, mas a atmosfera, juntamente com a hidrosfera, com solo, oceanos, fauna, flora. E essa evolução do direito ambiental se fez numa perspectiva de mosaico de elementos, uma perspectiva holística. Daí que cada um de nós poderia ter um interesse maior em um desses elementos, mas nós nos considerávamos e nos consideramos como especialistas em direito ambiental, in environmental law. Hoje, nós assistimos, como eu disse, esse processo migratório, quase que uma enxurrada de estudiosos que antes cuidavam do todo, se dirigindo às mudanças climáticas. Esta especialização dentro da especialização, vale dizer, a especialização em mudanças climáticas, dentro da especialização que é o direito ambiental, no contexto mais geral do direito, o direito ambiental é uma disciplina jurídica especial. Então, a especialização dentro da especialização não é um mal em si, mas passa a ser um mal quando se transforma em uma especialização que esquece o todo. Em outras palavras, ser especialista em direito do clima ou direito das mudanças climáticas não exclui a necessidade de não esquecer os outros elementos do meio ambiente, como, por exemplo, a biodiversidade ou a paisagem. Tudo faz parte de um todo, e é sobre isso que eu gostaria de tratar nesse primeiro momento. Ou seja no que se refere à realidade em si, seja no que se refere às primeiras normas de direito ambiental, ainda nos anos 70 e, sobretudo, 80, na nossa região, nós lidávamos com aquilo que eu denomino integração natural. Uma só biosfera composta de muitos elementos. Esta integração natural, no entanto, com o passar dos anos, sofre aquilo que eu chamo de desintegração não natural. Unnatural disintegration. E isto ocorre por várias razões, que eu não vou aqui analisar. Esta unnatural disintegration não é desarrazoada. Em alguns casos é até lógica e não se pode evitar. Esta desintegração não natural começa no plano ético e não é de agora. Se olharmos a cosmologia dos vários povos desde a antiguidade, nós vamos ver que as deusas e os deuses se associavam a elementos da natureza. Aí tínhamos desde o deus da chuva, a deusa da caça, já, portanto, de uma atividade e não de um elemento, ou mesmo entre nós católicos, os que são católicos, os padroeiros de determinados elementos da natureza ou de atividades humanas associadas a elementos da natureza. Esta desintegração não natural está conosco até hoje e cria enormes dificuldades, não só para a formulação jurídica, mas, sobretudo, para a aplicação das normas jurídicas. Nós, seres humanos, e do outro lado, mas fora de nós, todo o resto. Um antropocentrismo exagerado. Mas, além dessa desintegração ética, que está fora do direito, é metajurídica, nós assistimos a uma desintegração regulatória. E essa desintegração regulatória também não é recente, porque antes mesmo do surgimento do direito ambiental, nós já tínhamos normas de proteção das águas. Aliás, um dos primeiros códigos, talvez o primeiro código de proteção das águas tenha sido de Mendoza, na Argentina, na nossa região. Então, lei para água, lei para florestas, legislação em alguns países especificamente para alguns habitats, como manguezais. E, mais recentemente, legislação de proteção do clima. Esta fragmentação ou desintegração regulatória vai além, porque nós temos também, vai além dos elementos, porque nós temos normas, sistemas jurídicos, microsistemas jurídicos, que cuidam de atividades específicas associadas aos elementos. Então, vários países da nossa região têm lei de pesca, lei de caça, lei de mineração e assim sucessivamente. Ao lado desta desintegração legislativa, ocorre, em paralelo, e às vezes de uma forma mais acentuada, a desintegração da implementação. E aí são agências, no plano administrativo, especializadas em alguns desses elementos ou em algumas dessas atividades. Mas sobre esse aspecto, eu vou tratar na segunda metade da minha intervenção. Então, começamos. Desintegração ética, desintegração regulatória e também a desintegração na governança. Eu acabei de mencionar que a governança de atividades muitas vezes separa atividades associadas com elementos do meio ambiente que fazem parte de um todo maior. E, por fim, nós temos desintegração judicial. E aqui não é nenhuma novidade, porque a organização judicial dos países se faz pela desintegração, pela fragmentação, a divisão do território naquilo que nós chamamos de jurisdição. Esse, então, o pano de fundo, a introdução que eu gostaria de apresentar numa aula introdutória, para que guardem no decorrer do curso. Que, se por um lado é importante nós estarmos focando nos aspectos jurídicos das mudanças climáticas, por outro, nós não podemos esquecer que as mudanças climáticas fazem parte de um todo maior que afeta a biosfera. Passemos à segunda parte da minha intervenção, em que eu disse que vou, talvez, apresentar mais perguntas do que propriamente respostas. Perguntas porque esta é uma aula inaugural de abertura de um curso longo. A primeira pergunta, e eu acho que a gente já pode responder aqui, é se o direito das mudanças climáticas terá, e se quiserem, já tem, uma força transformativa do sistema jurídico tão gigantesca como foi o direito do trabalho no final do século XIX e primeira metade do século XX. O direito do trabalho, nós sabemos, não só separou os serviços do Código Civil, mas criou um sistema extremamente sofisticado de normas, de jurisprudência e de cortes para decidir os litígios das relações de trabalho. Pois bem, a pergunta que fica é se o direito às mudanças climáticas terá força para fazer as transformações profundas e não apenas superficiais no direito privado e no direito público, no mesmo patamar ou em patamar assemelhado ao direito do trabalho. Porque não há dúvida que o direito do trabalho transformou as fundações do direito público e do direito privado. E eu disse que talvez nós pudéssemos já responder essa pergunta aqui, porque, embora essa disciplina jurídica seja tão jovem, não há dúvida que, com a rapidez e com os desenvolvimentos que nós já assistimos no processo, o direito às mudanças climáticas tem o potencial para transformar em profundidade o ordenamento jurídico como um todo, e não apenas criar um nicho regulatório, um microsistema jurídico, para tratar de uma questão que não pode ser enfrentada pelo sistema normativo geral ou comum. A segunda pergunta é: qual o papel da ciência neste quadro? Será que os juízes, especialmente, vão fazer uso abundante do conhecimento científico, como ocorre em outras áreas do direito, como, por exemplo, da propriedade intelectual? Porque é evidente que no mundo todo há juízes decidindo litígios acerca de questões jurídicas complexas que estão muito além do seu conhecimento, como, por exemplo, em software e agora questões de inteligência artificial generativa. Eu acredito que isto é inevitável. Ao contrário do que, por vezes, se observa, por exemplo, no direito penal, em que, frequentemente, o juiz penal pode simplesmente dizer: eu não vou utilizar esta perícia, porque não me parece adequada em relação ou no contexto dos testemunhos que foram aqui apresentados por pessoas que estiveram presentes no local do crime. Quer me parecer que no direito das mudanças climáticas será inevitável, e já é inevitável, o uso abundante do conhecimento científico e um uso sem hesitação por parte do juiz. Claro, há sempre os negacionistas, os que são anti-ciência, mas aqui também não é novidade. Eles sempre existiram. Não é algo que surge apenas com o direito das mudanças climáticas. Uma outra questão é qual o papel do direito nacional e, a partir daí, dos juízes nacionais no direito das mudanças climáticas. E aqui, o fundamental, eu tenho certeza que Daoud Zelk e os outros colegas vão trabalhar bem esses temas, mas o fundamental é nós lembrarmos que o direito às mudanças climáticas inclui não só mitigação, mas também adaptação. E o papel do juiz e do legislador nacional é relevante nos dois aspectos, mas a relevância maior, aquela que faz parte quase que do cotidiano dos juízes, é no âmbito da adaptação. Por exemplo, é possível, nos nossos países, se fazer um licenciamento ambiental de um resort à beira-mar, sem levar em consideração as mudanças climáticas? Não é possível. É possível a construção de uma grande hidrelétrica sem levar em consideração os impactos das mudanças climáticas, até no custo econômico, na análise custo-benefício. Vamos ter água suficiente para esta hidrelétrica gerar os lucros que se espera? Evidentemente que não é possível. As mudanças climáticas têm, especialmente os aspectos de adaptação, têm que estar presente nesses instrumentos tradicionais do direito ambiental. Isso vale para áreas protegidas e todos os cantos do direito ambiental nacional vão ser afetados pelos temas da adaptação. E nenhum juiz vai questionar esse aspecto. Falta de água é um assunto local. A savanização das florestas tropicais também é um problema local. Quando eu digo que é local, não é que não haja repercussões regionais e internacionais, mas é algo que o juiz pode ver e sentir, e a população também. O aumento do nível do mar, a erosão, isso se apresenta localmente. Daí que nenhum juiz vai questionar que os aspectos associados à adaptação se relacionam diretamente com a jurisdição e com as regras que limitam a atuação do juiz de competência. Já no que tange à mitigação, aí sim há juízes que não creem que seja uma tarefa de juízes que têm a sua pequena jurisdição decidir sobre questões que demandam uma coordenação global. Mas aqui há um equívoco. É que é verdade que nenhum juiz sozinho pode resolver os problemas das emissões de gases do efeito estufa. Mas é possível a atuação desses juízes no sentido de mitigar a emissão desses gases. Mas esse é um debate que nós podemos ter em um outro momento, mas que, de todo modo, eu quis aqui trazer de uma maneira superficial, ou seja, o papel do direito nacional e dos juízes nacionais nesse tema das mudanças climáticas. E eu reitero, um papel muito mais compreensível, até pelos não especialistas, no âmbito da adaptação e menos compreensível, mas de todo modo necessário, no que se refere à mitigação. E, por último, uma pergunta que tem a ver diretamente com o título do programa deste curso. É se os desenvolvimentos no direito do clima e as inovações que sejam realizadas no âmbito dessa disciplina jurídica, se tudo isso, o novo, pode, num efeito bumerangue, refletir positivamente no desenvolvimento do próprio direito ambiental e dos direitos humanos. E vice-versa, se desenvolvimentos mais recentes na pauta dos direitos humanos podem auxiliar o direito das mudanças climáticas e não apenas na perspectiva antropocêntrica, mas na disciplina jurídica como um todo. Em síntese, a pergunta é: pode e de que maneira afilha o direito do clima mudar a mãe o direito ambiental ou os direitos humanos? Eu estou exatamente no meu tempo. Queria agradecer o convite que me foi feito. Vou ficar aqui para assistir pelo menos uma parte das próximas apresentações. Certamente ouvirei a apresentação do meu querido amigo Daoud Selke. Obrigado.
Muchas gracias, doctor Benjamin. Muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación, muchas gracias por tus ideas, muchas gracias por tus preguntas, por abrir debates. Creo que esta pregunta fundamental acerca de la fuerza del derecho del cambio climático en el ámbito jurídico está unida a no olvidarse de la dimensión ética de la disciplina jurídica como un todo, que es parte de lo que quisiste señalarnos. Y que todas estas ideas van a ser retomadas a lo largo de las distintas sesiones que tengamos en la diplomatura. Bueno, nuestro segundo expositor es el doctor Durwood Selke, abogado ambientalista, presidente y fundador del Instituto para la Gobernanza y el Desarrollo Sostenible. Es uno de los principales promotores de las estrategias de mitigación rápida, con especial énfasis en la reducción de contaminantes corta. Además de su extensísima trayectoria académica, que incluye docencias en muchas universidades internacionales, el doctor Selke ha sido una voz fundamental en los debates globales sobre gobernanza climática, un verdadero referente para quienes trabajamos en la intersección entre el derecho y el clima. Durwood, muchas gracias por aceptar esta invitación. Te escuchamos.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a real privilege and an even greater privilege to follow my friend, Justice Antonio Benjamin. So that was a great introduction with some provocative questions that Justice Antonio gave at least the initial answer to. I'll be raising some additional questions, and I'm going to start my discussion with the science, because the science is intimately related to the law when it comes to climate change and will demand great understanding and appreciation from all involved in climate litigation, whether it's human rights or based on other legal theories. It is going to be critical to master this science. The simple approach is to think of the climate emergency that the world is currently in terms of temperature, time, and tipping points. It's too hot. If you're reading the newspaper, if you're paying attention to fires and floods and hurricanes and tornadoes, droughts, you'll see that at the current level of warming, which is just above 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level, the world is already too hot, and the impacts are already damaging human rights and other rights. So temperature, but time is the next important element, because time is running out so quickly before we hit the irreversible climate tipping points. And right now, as I said, the temperature is just above 1.5 degrees for the last at least 12 months. And while the scientific body for the climate convention, called the IPCC, says that we really need to look at the midpoint of a 20-year average, the most advanced scientists tell us we have already locked in this 1.5 degrees. It's in the rearview mirror, in the words of scientist Dr. James Hansen. And in fact, the Financial Times today in London had a story about the new data that shows we are on course right now for almost 2 degrees of warming within the next 5 years. That's if we don't change, if the law doesn't demand change. So time is short. And then tipping points are incredibly important to understand, because right now, most of the impacts that the world has felt from the warming we already have experienced would be considered linear impacts. They're in proportion to the warming, a bit more warming and a bit more damaging impact. But when we hit a tipping point, we shift to non-linear impacts, where a little more warming causes a tremendously disproportionate increase in climate damage. And these tipping points will include, for example, the ones we know about, the destruction of the Amazon, the die-off of the Amazon rainforest, the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, which has 7 meters of sea level rise in it, the shutdown of the Atlantic overturning circulation, which carries warm water from the tropics up to northern Europe and into the Arctic, and then sinks back down and circulates cool water back to the tropics. When we lose that circulation, which one of the latest papers from Dr. Hansen just a couple of months ago says could be in the next 20 to 30 years, then we risk losing the West Antarctic ice sheet, which has up to 50 to 80 feet of sea level rise. Okay? This is catastrophic for the future. So again, temperature, time, and tipping points. Then the litigators need to understand the different strands of climate evidence. So we have three different strands. We have one where we look backwards to the paleoclimate science, where we have really great records from ice cores, from sediment samples, and from tree rings that allow us to reconstruct back hundreds of thousands of years, at least 800,000 years. So we can see what the climate was like when we reached the temperatures we're in today. And it is a very different and very damaged world compared to today. So that's looking backwards. And then we have the climate supercomputers that allow us, based on assumptions we put in, to look forward. And that's important. But again, these are based on assumptions. And the saying about assumptions in a climate model, in case you haven't heard it, are that you can get any result you want from a model if you torture your assumptions enough. And so you have to be skeptical about models, but they're very important. And then we have the third strand of evidence, which is simply looking out the window, the observations. This is increasingly important because the signs of climate change have shown up. They're showing up on a daily basis around the world. So you put those three together, and as litigators, as judges, we all need to understand that history. And then let me spend a couple more minutes on the tipping points, because this is where we risk losing control of the climate system, entering what the climate scientists are calling hothouse Earth, where we have the first tipping points start and they set off a domino effect or a cascade that causes other tipping points to accelerate. Some of the tipping points are also self-amplifying feedbacks. And so when you lose the Amazon rainforest, it turns into a savanna. It stops pulling carbon dioxide, one of the most important climate pollutants, out of the atmosphere and storing it safely in the biomass and in the soil. And that CO2 then remains in the system. And as the forest dies off, it gives back its the CO2 that it has stored, the carbon dioxide it has stored, and accelerates warming. So we want to be extremely careful about these. We want to be extremely knowledgeable about them as well. Another is the northern permafrost. We call it permafrost because it is permanently frozen. Well, that's what we used to call it. Now it's beginning to thaw. And when the permafrost thaws, it releases both carbon dioxide and one of the super climate pollutants, methane, which on a 20-year basis is like 86 times more powerful than carbon dioxide on its own. So this is another both feedback, a self-amplifying feedback, and a tipping point. So there will come a point with the northern permafrost where warming will collapse the permafrost, and we'll have a big spike of these new climate pollutants. And there's even a more dangerous piece that is not well understood from the East Siberian Shelf, where methane hydrates are deep under the ocean, and they are starting to be liberated too. We don't know much about them. We don't know how fast that will occur. But what this means for judges and litigators is there's a very complex system of climate science that needs to be understood. Then beyond that, of course, we need to understand what are the causes of climate change? How do we learn not just about carbon dioxide, which is about 55% of warming, but how do we learn about the other nearly half, which we generally refer to as non-carbon dioxide climate pollutants. And among those, the most important are the super climate pollutants. I already mentioned methane, but the other super climate pollutants include HFCs, or hydrofluorocarbons, which are the refrigerants in everybody's refrigerator, air conditioner, including in your automobile and in your home. And then black carbon soot. If you've ever been behind a dirty old bus going uphill, you see that black smoke coming out. That's black carbon soot. Very damaging for public health and very bad for climate, including when it falls on snow and ice and darkens the snow and ice, which reduces the reflectivity and allows more incoming solar radiation to melt the ice and snow faster and cause still more warming. The last of the super pollutants is tropospheric ozone, generally known as ground level smog. Again, very bad for public health, also very bad for agriculture. So there are multiple reasons for taking care of the climate super pollutants. Now, to continue the science lesson, if we go back to the need for speed, if we literally have 5 years, maybe it's going to be 10, we don't know. But it's a very short interval before we lose control of the climate system. We have to ask, of the different climate pollutants, which ones can we turn off the fastest, and which ones will bend the warming curve? Which ones will actually cool us down the fastest? That seems like a very logical question to be asking. And when you do ask it, the first pollutant you would look at would be carbon dioxide. Again, it's a little more than half. It comes from burning fossil fuels and cutting down forest. And yet, when you shut down the power plants that are emitting the carbon dioxide, surprisingly, you're actually causing some warming. And that's because when you shut down one of these power plants, you don't just shut down carbon dioxide as you might when you're working a model in a computer, but you shut down all the co-emitted pollutants as well. And one of those co-emitted pollutants is highly reflective sulfates that both reflect incoming solar radiation back to space, and they also nucleate reflective clouds. So right now, that sulfate pollution, which is bad for public health, bad for agriculture, bad for forest, it causes acid rain. But it is masking about a half a degree Celsius of warming, maybe more, could be up to a full degree. So decarbonization, as we refer to shutting down fossil fuels and moving to clean energy, is absolutely essential for us, but it's not fast. We have to think of it as a marathon. At 2050, if we were to succeed in moving to complete clean energy, which is possible, but politically difficult, we would avoid about 1/10 of a degree Celsius of warming. Not until 2060 does the reduction of the fossil fuel carbon dioxide really kick in, and it starts moving faster and giving us more and more climate protection. So if that's a marathon, what kind of a race would we be running if we look to the non-CO2 super climate pollutants? Well, it turns out cutting the super climate pollutants is a sprint that in the next 10 years, we could get 4, maybe even up to 6 times more avoided warming at 2050 than we can from just decarbonizing. So you think of these two races. We have to run them both simultaneously, and we have to win them both. But if we don't win the near-term sprint, we're going to have a hard time even staying in the race for the marathon to decarbonize. So this is a bit of the science, but litigators and judges again have to also understand the technologies. What are the solutions if you want to shut down methane emissions If you shut down methane, that's the single biggest and fastest lever we can pull. It's being referred to as the methane emergency brake because it can avoid about 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming by the 2040. So it's the biggest and the fastest. But how do you do it? Well, you have to know that major part, maybe a third of methane emissions come from fossil fuel, the whole value chain of fossil fuel. Methane is natural gas. Natural gas is methane. So you have to understand that natural gas, which is really fossil gas, is methane in a highly dangerous super climate pollutant. So how do you get the reductions of methane in the fossil fuel sector? Well, there are strategies. I mean, there are technologies. And in fact, 70% of all the emissions from the fossil fuel sector can be done with existing technologies and at no net cost. So you can picture a judicial ruling that concludes, you should not waste natural gas and pollute the climate at the same time. This is you can go back to the early common law. You go back to Coke on Littleton. They have the doctrine of waste. That I'm sure Professor Benjamin would know about as well. So, and then after you take care of the fossil fuel emissions of methane, you'd say, what's next? Well, next would be methane from landfills. And so you would want to learn the technologies for capturing the methane there and turn it into valuable fuel and stopping the loss of food waste and by having a better cold chain and teaching people how to compost their organic waste instead of putting it in a landfill where it turns into methane. And then finally, you have the agricultural sector, and that's always politically the most challenging. And so a judge might say in a case that involved methane from agriculture, well, why don't you give me a plan that actually is one, I might say to the plaintiffs, give me a plan that is good for the farmer and good for the climate. And the litigators, the plaintiffs' lawyers would come back and say, well, there are feed additives, for example, if you're at a concentrated feedlot, if you're at a dairy farm. There are genetic modifications if you're looking a little further ahead. There are ways to deal with manure lagoons, again, from concentrated feedlots. And those are all available today. And there are more that are being developed. So this would be, again, a challenge for a litigator, plaintiff who would not want to come in and say, Your Honor, we want to shut down all the farms in our region because farmers have enough time, enough difficulty, hard enough time feeding the world today. And so they don't need an extra burden unless it's a very elegantly placed burden that actually should be helping them. So a couple of words, and I've really lost track of the time. So somebody's going to have to signal me if I've got a couple minutes left. But there are, this is a seminar about human rights and climate. And so, how does the human rights system evolve? We have one, great case from the European Court of Human Rights on the Swiss grannies case. We have the pending advisory opinion on the climate emergency from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. This is expected to be a very important decision. We hope it comes out in the next few weeks or a couple of months at the most. And let's see how far the court is willing to go to explain the climate science and explain the connection with human rights law. The court received more than 250 submissions. The court held several days of hearings, first in Barbados, and then several days more in Brazil. And I happened to testify at the one in Barbados, and the court sat from like 8:30 in the morning to 8 o'clock at night and listened attentively to everyone who was testifying, and asked probing questions. I mean, they had showed deep understanding of the issues there. So that's going to be one of the most important evolutions in the development of human rights and climate. Is that my signal there? Okay. Um, the if I have a couple more minutes, and Madeline, are you keeping track of the time? Oh, good. I have more time. Okay. So the following the discussion by Justice Benjamin, I was thinking about the evolution of law. I'm from a common law country, and so we have, tort law, and you can trace the Industrial Revolution, the history of the Industrial Revolution, through the evolution of tort law as it evolved to deal with all of these new threats that came from changes in technology as we industrialized. And you can see, other uh, areas of law, and I'm thinking of this wonderful book by another friend of mine, Philippe Sands, called East West Street, which describes the two lawyers, Lemkin and Lauterpack, who in the 1930s independently came up with two very important human rights principles: one, um, genocide, and the other, crimes against humanity. And both of those were very important for the Nuremberg trials of the Nazi atrocities. So that I love that part of law, how the new issues can be taken up and lead to new law. One legal theory from um, malpractice law that's emerging is one that I hope to see applied to climate change at some point, called loss of chance of survival. So if your physician didn't diagnose your ailment properly and in a timely way, and your chances of survival go down, that is a tort in some jurisdictions. And that, to me, that just begs for a climate case and a climate hero judge who says, yes, let's apply that in the climate context. Now we have, cases. We've got a couple of thousand climate cases going on around the world. Many of them are human rights cases. Some are tort cases. Some are, many are civil law cases, but similar to tort. And one that was decided today is the Lulia case against RWE, the big German utility, where a Peruvian farmer sued the big utility and said, your contribution to climate change, which is about 0.4% of climate emissions, is enough for the court to have jurisdiction and to issue a remedy to protect me from the melting glaciers behind me that might someday cause flooding. Now, the court did not agree with the facts, and so didn't give the relief. But the findings of law were very powerful on attribution, on potential damages, and the court did note, for example, that we've known about climate change since at least 1958, when Keeling started measuring carbon dioxide emissions from Mauna Loa in Hawaii, and that's been a continuous measurement ever since. Very, very important. And the court also observed that the fossil fuel industry has known from at least 1968, I think, was the time they picked. And so this is a lot of the strong predicate for further damage cases. Right now, there are about 60 damage cases on climate going around that are already underway. And so we would expect many more to be filed following this precedent. So it's a very exciting time to be learning about climate change, to be learning about litigation. And, I was going to start my remarks by telling a story about when I was litigating with the Department of Justice and then with Earth Justice, the premier litigation non-governmental group in the US. I used to think that the only really good lawyers were lawyers who were litigators, that you had to be, you had to have your mettle tested in court. You had to learn how to fight. Now, I've learned that there are other brilliant lawyers that haven't been litigators, but you, all of you who are in this course, most of you, I hope, are litigators, will be looking at cases, and you are perhaps the most important lawyers in the world for bringing the climate science, the technologies, the remedies, and convincing the judges that, and I hope the judges who are on this course will be easier to convince that this is an existential moment and as an existential threat, and that they are the ones who have to stand up. And just like with genocide and crimes against humanity, we need a new legal principle of ecocide that has got to become part of the jurisprudence of the future. So a very exciting time, and I wish you all great success. And I'm going to be paying close attention, and I hope I get to work with many of you on this call and help you with your understanding and with your specific cases as well. So thank you again. And I see my friend
Marcos,
Professor...
vai ver pouco de TV, Marcos. Sai do computador.
Okay. I see my friend Professor Ramanathan is here, ready to go. And I gave you a science lesson, but let me say, I learned that from Professor Ramanathan. Okay. I mean, he's the one who has been my tutor, my mentor, and helped me understand this over quite a long time, Rob. It's been 15, I think it's been maybe 17 years. So I hope that I've been a good student. And thank you all. I'll stop here.
Muchas gracias, doctor Selke. Muchas gracias por sus palabras. Muchas gracias por destacar la importancia de entender la ciencia del clima y las causas del cambio climático y el rol que juegan los supercontaminantes para utilizarlos en las estrategias dentro de los litigios climáticos. Bueno, finalmente vamos a presentar al doctor Ramanathan, una figura clave en la ciencia del clima, profesor del Instituto de Oceanografía Scripps de la Universidad de California en San Diego y miembro de la Academia Nacional de las Ciencias de Estados Unidos. Su trabajo pionero sobre aerosoles contaminantes y contaminantes climáticos ha sido decisivo en la comprensión del cambio climático. Fue uno de los principales científicos detrás de la encíclica Laudato Si y ha sido reconocido como el científico del clima del Papa Francisco. Su enfoque integra la ciencia, la ética y el compromiso por el bien común. Nosotros contar con tu presencia, Ram. Muchas gracias por aceptar nuestra invitación. Te escuchamos.
Should I start?
Yes, thank you.
Oh. Let me try to share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we see. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. My good friend and colleague, Professor Derwent Zalke, just spoke to you. And I met him about 15 to 16 years ago. And it's been an incredible journey with him. While I was able to share the knowledge about science, he likewise educated me on how do you take that science and translate it into policy. What I'm going to talk to you today is, I titled it Climate Resilience. It sort of presents a new approach to addressing the climate issue so that we can survive the crisis mode we are in now and thrive. Just to give you a brief introduction to this, scientists like me, we've been hoping and helping policymakers like Zalke about cut down the emissions, bending the emissions curve. The emissions curve is going up and up and up. And we've been working on how to bend that curve. It's called mitigation, mitigating the emissions. And I realized about 10 years ago, I'll tell you how, that we are not going to cut the emissions in time. We will eventually cut it, but not now. And our science told us, while we are waiting for the world to cut down the emissions, the warming will pass a key threshold. Not 100 years from now, not 50 years from now, not even 30 years from now, just 5 years from now. That was our prediction, 2030 to 2035. So we felt, in addition to cutting down the emissions, don't get me wrong, we have to cut down the emissions. So mitigation is the first important pillar, that we have to help people adapt to the climate change, okay? Because the climate change is already here. I'm in California. Just this year, we experienced the worst disaster this state has ever experienced. Okay? That single fire event has cost the state about $200 billion, somewhere between 150 to 200. And compare that with the annual budget of the state is 330 billion. So it's just, if you have to recover the loss in 1 year, we have to increase our taxes by 80%. So that's what I mean by saying we have entered into a crisis mode and we need a new approach. So I think I may be repeating some of Dr. Zalke's already, but let me just start with the carbon dioxide problem, okay? And we have been emitting since middle of the 19th century, 1850 onwards. We've been emitting for the last 500 years, but it became intense with the Industrial Revolution. And it's accumulating. The problem with the carbon dioxide is that, let's say that you're going to drive back home. The emission from your car, about half of that emission will stay for 100 years or more, 50%. And 20% of what you and I emitted today would last for 1,000 years. So what happens then? This carbon dioxide travels around the planet. Okay, let's say I'm assuming one of you is in Brazil. What I emitted today would come to Brazil probably somewhere between 6 months to a year. It'll go to the Antarctic, it'll go to the Arctic, so it covers the whole planet like a blanket, okay? So how heavy is that blanket? It's about 1,200 billion tons thick. Imagine that. but 1.2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide is up in the air. Just to give you a perspective, what 1,200 billion tons mean, our total solid waste, everything we throw, what we eat, our plastic, our old cars, etc., etc., etc. The total weight of that junk, solid junk, is about 1.5 to 2 billion tons. This thing on top of our head is 1,200 billion tons. So it's about somewhere between 500 to 1,000 years of solid junk is already up in the air. Sadly, our eyes cannot see gases, so that's why we can't see this massive stuff sitting on our head. Okay, so that's the problem with CO2. We're leading to a climate change which is going to last for 500 years to 1,000 years. And this is what the science was. Everybody thought it was just carbon dioxide. I entered this field exactly 50 years ago, 1975. And I published a study showing we are putting other heat trapping gases. I'm sure Dr. Zalke talked about the superpollutants. So this was the first superpollutant which was discovered. I was working at NASA then, and I found a ton of these gases, these chlorofluorocarbons were emitted as propellants, your spray cans, but mainly air conditioners and refrigerators. And I found a ton of this would have the same effect as about 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide. Huge thing. But fortunately, thanks to the pioneering work of lawyers like Zalke, legal experts, they were phased out. So that's the origin of the superpollutant. So we are emitting carbon dioxide on the one hand, which is a long-lived, it just doesn't die. Okay, its lifetime is 500 years to several thousand years. And then these superpollutants. Okay, and so there is one thing I want to convey. I didn't realize this. 2 weeks ago, I joined a major NGO summit in Los Angeles. They are all of them are working on climate mitigation. Somehow I thought their goal was to cut down all the emissions from LA. Some of the implicit understanding I thought was, if you cut down the emissions over Los Angeles won't heat up. Not really. But everyone has to cut down. The reason, as I told you, I cut down I live in San Diego, just about 100, about 150 kilometers from Los Angeles. Even if we cut down our emission to zero, nothing will happen. We will still heat up because the rest of the world is emitting. So the key understanding I would like you to have is this cartoon came in time. Emission anywhere is global heating everywhere. Okay? So this is a problem we have to work together. I'm not saying that we shouldn't cut down our emissions. Remember, the change, the revolution starts with an individual. So we have to cut emissions, but we cannot have the faulty expectation. Oh, I cut down my emissions, so I'm not going to be subject to global warming. Okay? So it's a global issue. And so let's talk about that. I forgot to mention that right now, about 40% of the heat trapped is by the superpollutants. Another 50 to 55 to 60 is for carbon dioxide. So there are two separate problems we have. Okay, as Dr. Zalke would have informed you, the good news about the superpollutants is that we have technology to face them down. The methane, the black carbon, and fluorocarbons, et cetera, et cetera. We have the technology. We just need the political will to cut them down. So let's talk about this. So I told you we have created 1,200 billion tons. and teaming up with two colleagues, Yang Xu, he's at Texas A&M, and David Victor, he's my colleague here. We predicted in 2018 that the warming would exceed 1.5 degrees. When we published the paper, the warming had just crossed 1 degree. And many scientists thought at that time the prediction was we're not going to cross this till 2045. Now everyone has come around. In fact, in 2023, the planet just went up to 1.5 but came down. We don't think of 1 year change as global warming or climate change. It has to be longer than 5 to 10 years. So why are we harping on this 1.5 degrees? When we cross that, we're pretty close to crossing it. That would be a climate no human being or no species we know of had experienced it. It happened about 250,000, 250,000 years ago when the planet was warmer. Okay? So we are crossing a new threshold in the planet's climate soon. That is why I'm thinking we need a new approach. Okay? And of course, our first target in mitigation has to be cutting down fossil fuels. Not only for the climate change, a bigger thing is the air pollution from fossil fuels. Remember the black smoke you see coming out of your tailpipe or a gray smoke? They're killers, and they kill about 5 million, cause 5 million deaths in children, adults worldwide.
Alrededor de 5 millones de muertes semestres.
Was that for me? Anyway.
No, Professor Ram, excuse me.
No problem. Thank you. So now, what's all this urgency about? This was not predicted by many of us, that we were focused on sea level rise. It turns out that the most serious problem we are facing is global warming leading to extremes, weather extremes. So we call it climate disruption or climate crises. And I list some statistics: heat stress, heat waves. The rain, when it's coming, it's falling down more. And we know the scientific reason, because when you heat the air gets more humid. Remember, hot and humid, okay? Because more vapor is evaporating from the ocean, and so it comes down as intense rainfall. On droughts, mega droughts, California is experiencing major droughts. I'll talk to you about droughts in South America soon. And these disasters are increasing exponentially. If you look at the number of disasters since 1970s and now, they've increased by 400 to 500%. And the total loss is also, the economic consequences are also huge at $3.64 trillion US dollars. I want to mention to you one reason. Why is the weather getting extreme? And this was predicted by us, by a student of mine and myself. We looked at the observed record and predicted for every warming, this is observations, every warming rise in temperature, the humidity will increase by 5.5%. And this was published in 1989, and Nature has proved us right. Unfortunately, humidity is increasing. The air is getting more humid, okay? And remember, what kills people in the heat are a combination of two: increase in temperature, increase in humidity. Both are deadly. Why is that? Remember, on a hot day, you sweat, and the sweating cools your body, evaporation. But if the outside humidity is larger, the amount you can evaporate goes down. So you get hotter and hotter, okay? So this was the prediction. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm just, as a scientist, obligated to show everything. Any claim I make, I need to show the data. So this is what we showed when the red line, when it crosses 1.5, we said it's going to happen 2030. And we alerted the community 7 years ago that global warming is happening much faster than what people think, but very few paid attention to us. So if we don't cut down the emissions, right now we are cutting down the emissions a little bit, but the total emission is still going up. This is our prediction for the end of the century. What is interesting, first let me just point out, see the entire Southwest California and South America is going to be the most severely punished for this huge drought, the Brazil. And then you can look at the Mediterranean, parts of Europe and China, etc. What this tells you is that it's not that somebody will suffer, others will benefit. No, everyone is going to get hurt. And this is what I call, by the time the planet reaches 1.5 degrees in 5 to 10 years from now, climate change will move into your living room like COVID did a few years ago. Remember? Everyone we knew was affected by it. It was just not something happening in far places in Africa or South America. It was happening everywhere. That's what climate change would be when we look another 5-10 years from now. And this is Amazon. They're predicting major loss of resilience by our forest ecosystem. And the ripple effect of all of these, like I said, everyone will feel the effects. And you can see the climate weather extreme in the middle. That's going to affect the air quality, pollution. It'll increase your cost of living. Physical health is going to be impacted the most. There will be conflicts over resources from communities to communities, from one city to the next, from one nation to the next. The major thing that's happening is there is no documented studies of mental health. When you see your own house in fire or flooded or neighborhood, it works on your mental issues. We expect mass migration, heat stress, vector-borne disease. That is, the vectors, insects, mosquitoes, etc. They'll go to different ecosystem if the thing they are in gets too hot for them. Okay, so we're not just talking about one thing. We are talking about everything the society takes advantage of now. Oh. So we talked about mitigation. This was numerous studies. One I'm quoting here is the study which came from World Bank and then Bill Gates and the former WMO chief, Ban Ki-moon. If we don't check climate change over the next 50 years, it'll cost us $178 trillion. Have a huge impact on the economy. Okay, just if we are not moved by how we are affecting our own health and the health of our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and if you're rather focused on today's economy, the impact is still going to be huge. Okay, so there are multiple reasons for not letting this problem get out of hand. So I want to a little bit describe to you my own work. I was just purely doing science, and it took a drastic turn when I was elected to the Pontifical Academy by Saint John Paul II. So I have served 3 popes now. Pope Leo, we are going to be reporting to him, and he already seems enthusiastic about taking actions on climate change. I started thinking about societal response. My focus was just on how is the planet going to change. Okay, I started working more and more on how is it going to affect the people. So 2011, I organized my first meeting for Pope Benedict with another scientist, Paul Crutzen. In that meeting, and what we do in these meetings is that we get together as the Science Academy inside the Vatican. Normally we meet for 1 or 2 days and then report to the Pope. Our academy reports directly to the Holy Father. Okay, we don't go into any other institution of the Vatican. So there we concluded, this was 14 years ago, in addition to mitigation, adaptation must start now and be pursued aggressively. Some listen, but if you look at the amount of money spent on climate actions, 92% goes for mitigation, just 8% on adaptation. Okay. Then 2014, we said we need to broaden this. Is humanity going to survive this? Sustainable humanity, sustainable nature. And the church put the phrase, our responsibility. Till then, I didn't think it's my responsibility. So I briefed Pope Francis right after that meeting. I'll show you. There was for me, it was a earth-shaking, life-changing moment. I presented data at the Academy on what I call the ethics of climate change. Pope Francis, in his book, Laudato Si, changed it to the morality. He called climate change a great moral sin. Some of that was based on the data I presented to him. If you break the whole population into 4 categories, high and upper middle income. Okay, I come under the upper middle income population. That's 3.8 billion, 51%. They emit 86% of the emissions. 86%. Then you look at the bottom half, lower and lower income. That's 3.7 billion. Their total emission is only 14%. Okay? Inside data is what I presented to Pope Francis. The poorest 3 billion, about 40%, have contributed less than 10%. It's close to 7%. But they suffered 75% of the economic damages and losses. So what does that mean? When I take a plane and travel, let's say, I go to the Vatican, my emissions would make thousands of families in African villages and Indian villages to poverty. They would lose their land, they would lose because of drought. Okay? So I think that is the most serious ethical issue we are facing. When we drive that car, when we go on that plane, we are not hurting ourselves, we are hurting people living in poverty, thousands of miles away. Okay? And Pope Francis took that and converted that into a beautiful thing. So this was the parking lot behind St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope's residence is there, and he invites us to stay in the residence he is in. And he, a year later, brought in what's called Laudato Si, our common home. To me, it's the best climate document ever written in the following sense: linked climate change to human suffering. If you look at most of the reports I had contributed, United Nations, until then, it was clinical documentation of climate change, its effects, but not linking it to human suffering. I just want to it's about this thick book. If you tell me, just give me one sentence from that book, it's that. Cry of the earth, should be heard with the cry of the poor. Okay. And he asked me when I mentioned this poor statistic, at that moment he's smiling, he asked, and how can I help? But he asked me in Italian. So I told Pope Francis, I wish I had learned Italian. I don't know what you're saying. So he smiled, and then somebody translated into English. So I told the Holy Father, I said, look, you're not only a spiritual leader for the Catholics, you've become a spiritual leader for the world. So I hope you would include climate change in when you preach and when you give your talks. And so I'm going to go to now a little bit describing resilience and what we need to do. So how do I define resilience? I am focusing on climate and weather extremes here. Okay, not on sea level rise, not on coastal flooding. They're all important. But I'm focusing on the next 5 to 15 years. What are we going to suffer from? I think it's climate and weather extremes, okay? So we need to anticipate the threats and risks. We need to reduce the threats and risks. Mitigation is one way to reduce the risks. We need to prepare for them. Very few of us are prepared. We need to respond to them. And then we need to recover from these threats and risks. Finally, we need to rebound. So our motto in the church is that survive and thrive, okay? So we said this resilience must rest on 3 pillars: mitigation to reduce the emissions, reduce the risk, and adaptation to unavoidable risks. And neither of the two are going to happen without societal transformation. We have, let's face it, we scientists and policymakers, we have left the public. They are not informed. I live in a reasonably high income community. Very few even here know about climate change. And they have a hard time understanding when I tell them the fires coming to your house is coming from climate change now. So it's not that I blame them, I blame myself. We have not done, so that's what we call societal transformation, mass education, okay? And letting people know the dangers ahead. We need to bring in the youth voices so they can talk to their parents at the dinner table. And it's happening in a big scale, but not big enough. So we are focusing on children, K-12 education. So let's talk about these 3 pillars, okay? The warming is about 1.2, we'll hit 1.5. So I'm saying even no matter what we do, we have to do, we can't bring it to less than 2 degrees. 2 degrees is already going to be catastrophic for the poorest 3 billion. See, when we talk about climate change, people say 2.5 degrees. No, we need to talk about this in terms of the poorest 3 billion, the middle 4 billion, and the upper 1 billion. All these populations are going to be impacted in different ways. Okay. So I'm not going to talk about this. This is about how do you cut the mitigation. I think Dr. Zalke would have mentioned all of this, particularly the carbon extraction. We just got to take that about 300 billion tons out of that 1,200 billion tons out. We can do this by enhancing the soil capacity and then really sucking the CO2 out of the ocean and the land. A lot of people are working on this, okay? The problem is I don't see the urgency yet in any attempts. So that's why I'm pushing for adaptation, okay? My thing is, my proposal is, and the Vatican is behind me, that we have to spend as much on adaptation as we are spending on mitigation. Right now, only 5% of the total amount, or 5 to 10% goes to adaptation. So So the risk, climate risk we face, I think of it as a possibility, as a product of vulnerability and threat. The threat is increasing CO2 and these super pollutants. So we mitigate to reduce the risk. But the key issue, vulnerability, I'll tell you, for example, in Los Angeles, we have a lot of homeless. In San Diego. When there is a heat wave, I'm just going to increase my air conditioning. But what do those poor people have? That's what we mean by vulnerability. They're sensitive, so we have to reduce their sensitivity. We have to reduce their exposure. I reduce my exposure by having an air conditioner. So the upper middle income could survive, but how about the poorest and those homeless? Okay? And then we have to bring the adaptive capacity. So we need to think about this adaptation for three categories: the poor, the middle income, and the upper income. Okay, the biggest threat for the upper income is losing house insurance. I have personally gone on record. We used to work with my former governor, Governor Jerry Brown, now with Governor Newsom. I advised Governor Newsom 8 years ago, by 2025 to 2030, very few of the California houses will be insurable. Already it's coming in my neighborhood, many can't get insurance, okay? So I'm not saying it's just a problem for the poor. Everybody's going to be affected, okay? The only thing we should never forget is the upper income, we are causing the problem. Our emissions are 84%, okay? So that's the ethical, as the church calls it, moral issue. I've listed this adaptation. I'm going to give these slides to Mr. Lucas, and you're welcome to distribute it. So I'm not going to go blow by blow. Yeah, probably we should wrap it up in a few minutes. But the key thing you have to know is we know the solutions, that we are not solving the problem, not because we don't know how to, but we don't know how to implement it. And we don't know how to implement it because there's no financial support. And there's no financial support because we have left the public behind. Why would they pay taxes if they don't know what they're doing it for? So the societal transformation, public education needs a lot of resources. Pillar 3, societal transformation, we want socioeconomic changes, behavioral changes. We need more trust in science, at least in America, US, mass education, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. Fortunately, the ecosystem folks have a lot of amazing solutions, of nature-based solutions that bring in the oceans, coax the ocean to take CO2, and coax our forests like Brazilian forests and others. So there are a lot of ways and become more sustainable. This is really what I think are revolutionary changes to live with nature. So far, we just take from nature. We don't give anything back. Imagine human relationship. If two partners, one gives and the other takes, that relationship is not going to survive. So how did I come with this idea of societal transformation? I was in a 80th birthday celebration of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And he asked me to talk about climate change. In the middle of it, he stopped me. He's showing his hand to me. He says, Dr. Ramanathan, tell me, how can you clean the outer environment without cleaning the inner environment? So that's where, to me, the societal transformation idea germinated. And we started a major climate education program called Bending the Curve. That's our two governors holding the report I had published with Professor Yafana Farman and Kamen from Berkeley. We are now teaching this course to all undergraduate students. It's just not for science students, everyone. Fine arts, this, all across San Diego. And it tells where the resilience has to be built. It's just not one or two. It's almost every institution your city has, your state has. I just listed things which we have in our California state. I just want to conclude, take 2 minutes to see what is the Vatican doing. Into 2022, I'm showing here, the Holy Father was there, Pope Francis. We said we will start a global movement on climate resilience. There we were focusing on the poor, the poorest 3 billion, okay? So we published a book. You can Google it and you can get it, or I can send the link to you. Then we followed it 2 years later, May 2024. We said we got to take climate actions at the local level. So far, we relied on our national leaders. And that is, I don't want to criticize, it's created a lot of climate action, but not fast enough. But who is going to suffer? It's the cities. So he said we had to bring them to the table. So we organized a summit for governors and mayors. And we released what Pope Francis called Planetary Call to Action for Climate Change Resilience. You can see the signatures on the top. The Holy Father's signature first, he signed as Francisco. Then we all signed, and we had mayors from London, Paris, Massachusetts, California, etc., etc., etc. Everyone signed. And what they said is we have to take this message by holding regional summits from around the world. So we launched the first one in California. It's already done. February 2028, about 5 or 6 governors came, our governor came, all the agencies, the NGOs, we had very legal minds. And we released this book. And you can see Governor Newsom, Pope Francis. And then I proposed to Governor Newsom at that time, hey, we should hold the first one in California. He said, I'm in. And he personally made sure it happened and provided a lot of support. So I want to conclude, if you're all feeling hopeless about the problem, I do. About 4 days out of 7, I feel hopeless, and then I cheer up. And this is what I think whenever I feel hopeless. This was done by the famous Thomas Edison. When you think you've exhausted all possibilities, remember you haven't. 10 years ago, I thought we've exhausted all the possibilities with mitigation. Then somehow the idea for resilience came. So each of you, I'm sure, will have something you will come up with, some possibility. I want to conclude with this thing of, proverbs. One is for the American Indian proverb. A frog does not drink up the pond in which it lives. But that's what we are doing. We are drinking up the pond. Okay? We need to put it back. Anything, and I think if you create a culture, a societal transformation, you take something, it's okay, because I'm not saying we should all live in caves. No, take whatever you want, but put it back. Figure out a way to put it back. And then this was amazing. This is a prayer from Sanskrit, from India, from the 16th century. It looks like they were hurting the nature even then. Look at this prayer. It says, O Mother Earth, ocean-girdled, mountain-breasted, pardon me for trampling on you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ram, for your words. I want to thank you especially from the Institute. You show us how climate change and justice are connected, and how building resilience is key to protect people and the planet. Thank you for reminding us the ethical dimension of both the causes and the consequences of climate change. And as you have highlighted in Laudato Si, and also in the chat, the participants has already has taken your words and making excellent contributions to the topic. So it's a big honor to finish this journey with your voice. I'm saying these words in English in name of the whole institute, and now I'm going to talk in Spanish for everyone. Muchas gracias, profesor. Y bueno, le cedo la palabra a Lucas, el secretario académico del instituto, para cerrar la jornada.
Thank you very much, Professor Ram. Bueno, hemos escuchado a lo largo de esta tarde a tres grandes referentes en cambio climático. Nos han ofrecido un panorama integral sobre los desafíos que plantea el cambio climático y el papel del derecho en su abordaje. Queda claro que el litigio climático no es solo una técnica procesal, sino una vía para democratizar el acceso a la justicia, visibilizar responsabilidades y abrir nuevos caminos en la construcción de un modelo de desarrollo sostenible, justo y sostenible. En América Latina y el Caribe, donde la crisis climática se entrelaza con las mayores desigualdades estructurales del planeta, con modelos coloniales de economías extractivas y vulnerabilidades ancestrales e históricas, el litigio climático adquiere un sentido profundo, se convierte en una forma de resistencia legal, de protección de derechos, de defensa de bienes comunes. La diplomatura en litigio climático que hoy hemos inaugurado nace con ese espíritu. No pretende formar solo expertas y expertos en derecho ambiental, sino formar agentes de cambio que comprendan la urgencia del momento histórico que atravesamos y estén dispuestos a actuar con coraje, fundamento regional. Nuestro enfoque es interdisciplinario porque el cambio climático no se comprende desde una sola mirada. Es práctico porque aspiramos a tener impacto tanto en tribunales como en las comunidades, y es profundamente ético porque entendemos que no hay neutralidad posible ante la devastación ambiental. Todos estos temas que hoy abordamos, la justicia climática, el papel transformador en el derecho y la urgencia de una acción ética y colectiva, serán profundizados a lo largo de la diplomatura. Esta propuesta académica no es solo un espacio de formación, como ya dije, es una invitación a sumarse a una comunidad crítica y comprometida con esta problemática. En un momento clave para la región, como ya señalé al comienzo de esta jornada, a poco tiempo de que la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos emita su opinión consultiva sobre emergencia climática y derechos humanos, creemos que este es el tiempo de diseñar estrategias para su futura implementación. La inscripción en la diplomatura todavía está abierta hasta este viernes, así que los invitamos a escribir al correo del instituto que está compartido en el chat del Zoom. Y bueno, y gracias nuevamente a nuestros grandes conferencistas por su generosidad y la profundidad en sus ideas, en sus palabras, en la invitación a debatir varias de las cuestiones que nos han invitado a pensar y a retomarlas a lo largo de las sesiones de la diplomatura. Y profundamente gracias a todos ustedes, a cada persona que nos acompañó hoy. Buenas tardes a todos.